The alarms hit all at once. 3 different tones, none of them good. A NATO commander was bleeding out on a gurney, moving at a dead sprint through the corridor, 26 medical personnel surrounding him, every one of them shouting over the others. The man had a hole in his chest, a shattered shoulder, and a blood pressure reading that had no business being compatible with a heartbeat. 25 of the most decorated trauma surgeons in the Alliance were already scrubbing in, and standing in the corner of Trauma Bay 1, in plain dark scrubs with a hospital ID that listed her title as Staff Nurse 2, was a 28-year-old woman from Dayton, Ohio, who was the only person in that building who already knew what was going to kill him. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to hit follow right now and stay with me until the very end, because this one goes places you will not see coming. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The name on the badge read Nora Whitaker. Nobody at Callaway Ridge Military Medical Center had bothered to learn it. That wasn't an exaggeration or a figure of speech. It was simply the operational reality of the place. Callaway Ridge sat 40 minutes outside of Fort Denison, Virginia, carved into a hillside that the Department of Defense had decided, in the mid-1980s, was the ideal buffer between classified activity and civilian population. The hospital itself was a brutalist structure. Gray concrete, narrow windows, fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency specifically designed to make everyone inside feel slightly worse than they had when they arrived. It served both active-duty military personnel and high-ranking NATO liaisons, which meant it existed in a permanent state of controlled tension. Everybody outranked somebody. Everybody was waiting for something to go wrong so they could demonstrate, in front of witnesses, that they were not the one who had let it go wrong. Into this environment, 6 weeks earlier, Nora Whitaker had arrived carrying a single rolling suitcase and a placement letter from the Interagency Civilian Medical Corps. The placement had been processed through bureaucratic channels that nobody at Callaway Ridge had specifically requested, and nobody had specifically approved. It had simply materialized, the way things do when multiple large institutions are simultaneously trying to demonstrate cooperation without actually communicating with each other. The letter said she was a credentialed trauma nurse. It said she had completed her certification at Hargrove Memorial Hospital in Ohio. It said she had 3 years of emergency department experience. What the letter did not say, because nobody had asked, and because Nora had not volunteered the information, was anything else. The first person she met was the charge nurse, a woman named Delphine Okafor, who looked at the placement letter, looked at Nora, looked back at the letter, and said, "You're from Ohio." "Yes, ma'am." "You've worked civilian ER." "That's right." Delphine handed the letter back without ceremony. "You'll be on the general ward, non-critical, vitals, wound care, medication administration. If anything flags critical, you refer it up the chain immediately, and you do not, I'm going to say this once, you do not make independent assessments in a trauma bay. Understood?" "Understood." The physicians here have an average of 19 years experience. Most of them have deployed. You will observe, you will assist when asked, and you will stay in your lane. Nora nodded. "Of course." Delphine studied her for a moment, the kind of look that was trying to find something to object to and couldn't quite locate it. Then she pointed down the corridor. "Ward C bed assignments are on the board." That was week 1. By week 3, the shape of the place had become clear to Nora in the way that shapes always became clear to her. Not through asking, but through watching. She had learned the rhythms of the shifts, the unofficial hierarchy that existed 3 layers beneath the org chart, and the unspoken rule that governed every interaction. Civilian staff were support infrastructure, not medical personnel. The distinction was enforced with varying degrees of politeness, depending on who was doing the enforcing, but it was never ambiguous. The man who enforced it least politely was Colonel Reginald Mathers, Chief of Trauma Surgery, a 53-year-old with 24 years of military medicine behind him, and the conversational style of someone who had never once been wrong in a professional setting and had the performance reviews to prove it. He was technically brilliant. His complication rates were among the lowest in the Alliance's medical network. He also operated as though civilian nurses were a form of sophisticated medical furniture, present, occasionally useful, not to be consulted. The first time he addressed Nora directly was during a shift change in week 2. She had been standing near the nurses' station when a post-op patient in the adjacent bay flagged an irregular rhythm on his monitor, something that didn't fit the expected post-surgical pattern. The waveform on bed 6 looks like it might be shifting toward, Nora began. Mathers didn't turn around. ECG interpretation is above your clearance level here. I wasn't interpreting, I was flagging it. He turned then. He had gray eyes that did the specific thing gray eyes do when the person behind them has decided the conversation is already over. What's your clearance, nurse? Staff nurse 2, civilian corps placement. Ohio? Yes, sir. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Stay on your ward. The rhythm had corrected itself within 40 minutes, so there was no consequence to the interaction. No incident report, no formal reprimand, nothing that would justify a grievance or a confrontation. There was only the fact of it, which Nora filed alongside everything else she was learning about this place. The other nurses had found their own ways to navigate the dynamic. Priya Sathuraman, who had been at Callaway Ridge for 2 years, explained it during a break on week 3 with the calm practicality of someone who has accepted a thing entirely. You have to understand the math, Priya said, wrapping her hands around a paper cup of coffee that had been sitting long enough to technically qualify as room temperature. These men, most of them, have been in places where a wrong call killed someone. They carry that. And then they come back here and they see someone from a civilian placement, 28 years old, and their brain does the calculation without asking permission. It says, not up here. And once it says that, it doesn't take it back. Even if the calculation's wrong? Priya looked at her steadily, especially then. Nora absorbed this. She went back to Ward C. She administered medication and changed dressings and monitored post-op patients through the night shifts. And she watched, the way she had always watched, the way she had learned to watch years before she ever set foot in a civilian hospital, in conditions that would have made Callaway Ridge's trauma surgeons rethink some of their assumptions about who understood medical pressure and who didn't. But that was a different life. She had closed the door on it deliberately, and she had reasons for keeping it closed. The third week brought Lieutenant Colonel Ava Drummond, a physician on temporary assignment from the NATO Medical Review Board, who was conducting a 72-hour assessment of Callaway Ridge's trauma protocols. Drummond moved through the hospital with the efficiency of someone who had seen 20 hospitals in the last 6 months and had stopped being impressed by most of them. She asked sharp questions, took notes in a small leather book, and left without offering conclusions. Before she left, she passed through Ward C. Nora was recalibrating an IV line when Drummond stopped in the doorway and watched her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostile, not particularly warm, just precise. "You've got clean hands," Drummond said. Nora looked up. "Excuse me?" "Your positioning when you work. The way you hold your hands above the field. That's not standard civilian nursing protocol." There was a pause that lasted about 1 second longer than it should have. "I picked up some habits from watching the surgical staff," Nora said. Drummond held her gaze a beat longer. Then she nodded once and walked away. Nothing came of it, but Nora noticed that Drummond had noticed, and she filed that too. The morning of the 39th day began like the mornings before it. Nora came on shift at 0600, ran through her handoff with the night nurse, a young man named Travis Weil, who had the slightly transparent look of someone who had been awake for 11 hours and was surviving on spite, and walked her assigned patients. Bed checks, vitals, a wound inspection on a recovering sergeant who had undergone spinal decompression surgery 4 days earlier and was making excellent progress if you discounted his complete refusal to perform his physical therapy exercises. "I'm going to need you to do the ankle rotation, Sergeant." "My ankle's connected to my spine right now through about 40 stitches and a metal plate. I'm not rotating anything. The plate is what's going to let you walk out of here. The rotations keep your circulation from stacking up in your legs, 20 seconds per foot." "You're very young to be this bossy." "I get that a lot. 20 seconds. He grumbled, but he did them. Small victories. By 0845, the ward was running smoothly, which at Callaway Ridge meant that nothing visibly bad was happening, which was the most optimistic state the building reliably achieved. Nora was updating a medication log at the nurse's station when she heard the first change in the building's ambient noise. It was subtle. A shift in the register of the PA system, a particular quality of movement in the corridor outside that was faster and more directional than routine. She put down the log. 3 minutes later, the overhead announcement came. Mass Casualty Protocol, Level 1. Trauma Bay 1 and 2. Level 1 at Callaway Ridge meant a high-priority patient with a security classification above general staff clearance. It meant the trauma bays were going to lock down and the civilian nursing staff were going to be redirected to holding corridors while military medical personnel took over. Nora had seen it happen once before, 4 weeks ago. A brief, controlled chaos that resolved in about 2 hours and produced no information about what had happened or who had been treated. She began moving toward the corridor, following the posted redirection. She made it about 60 feet before the second announcement hit. And this one was different because it named the trauma bay and the arrival time and the patient classification, and it used the word critical in a way that meant something specific and bad. She also heard, above the PA, the voice of Dr. Mathers cutting through the noise with the clipped authority of a man who had been running trauma for 2 decades. "I need Ortiz and Bennings in Bay 1. Right now. Move." The gurney came through the doors at 0902. The man on it was large, well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, wearing the remnants of a military dress uniform that had been cut away at the chest and left arm. He was unconscious. His face was gray in the way that faces go gray when the body has made a calculation about where blood is needed most urgently and has stopped worrying about aesthetics. There was a field dressing on his chest that was soaked through. The left side of his neck showed bruising that hadn't been there when the dressing was applied. It was fresh, blooming dark against pale skin, which meant something was still happening inside him. The ID board being carried by the accompanying military escort read, "General Mercer Aldane, NATO Command, Northern Alliance, NATO Clearance Alpha." Nora stopped walking. She stood at the edge of the redirection corridor, 15 feet from the entrance to Trauma Bay 1, and she watched them move him through the bay doors. She counted the personnel following him, 4 physicians, including Mathers, 3 surgical nurses with full trauma clearance, an anesthesiologist, 2 additional attending surgeons who were already gowned and moving with the particular focused economy of people who had rehearsed this exact scenario. The bay doors closed. Delphine Okafor appeared at Nora's left shoulder. "Whitaker, you need to be in Corridor B." "I know." "Then move." Nora moved. She walked to Corridor B, which was a holding area off the main hall, with a row of plastic chairs and a wall-mounted screen showing the building's status board. She sat down. Around her, 4 other civilian staff members were doing the same: 2 nursing assistants, a respiratory tech, and an orderly who had brought a paperback novel and was reading it with the philosophical calm of someone who had been through this before. The status board showed Trauma Bay 1. Active. Restricted. Nora watched it. The thing about watching, the real kind, the kind she had learned long before nursing school, was that it was never passive. It looked like passivity from the outside. The body was still, the face was neutral, the hands were in the lap. But inside, the mind was building a picture piece by piece, assembling data from fragments, the angle of the field dressing, the distribution of blood on the uniform, the pattern of the bruising on the neck, the specific way Mathers had said "right now," as opposed to the way he said it during routine urgencies. She was building the picture now. The uniform had been cut away at the chest and left shoulder. The field dressing was on the chest. The bruising was on the neck, high, near the carotid. The patient had been unconscious on arrival, which meant the brain had already been under pressure. The obvious injuries were the chest and left shoulder. Gunshot or shrapnel, given the NATO clearance level and the emergency classification. The surgeons would address those first, because they were the ones bleeding visibly. But the neck. The pattern of that bruising didn't fit a secondary injury from the same event that produced the chest wound. The distribution was wrong, too diffuse, too spread along the anterior margin. It looked like the product of sustained pressure rather than impact, which meant it was either very old, which it wasn't because it was still blooming, or it was being produced by something that was continuing to apply pressure from inside. The brain tried to discard this. She let it try. Then she went back to the picture. A foreign body. small enough to have been missed during the field triage, embedded in a location that would have been obscured by the primary injury and the blood distribution around it. Something pressing against a vessel, something that had been displaced or shifted during transport. It was a hypothesis. She did not have imaging data. She did not have a physical examination. She did not have any of the information the surgeons in that room had. She was a civilian staff nurse, too, in a holding corridor, constructing a theory from a glimpse of a man on a moving gurney. She knew that. She also knew what she had seen. What? 53 minutes passed. The status board maintained its single designation: active, restricted. No update. No change. In Nora's experience, Level 1 trauma cases at Callaway Ridge either resolved relatively quickly, 20 to 40 minutes for a controlled emergency, or they didn't, which meant something had gone wrong with the primary approach and the team was adapting. 53 minutes was the edge of that window. At the 57-minute mark, she heard Mathers through the wall. The corridor was concrete and the trauma bay wall was not particularly thick, and his voice had the carrying quality of a man who had spent decades making himself heard in loud environments. She couldn't catch words, but she could read the texture of it, the change from command to something else. Not panic. Mathers wouldn't panic, but the rhythm was different. The certainty was gone from it. She stood up. The orderly with the paperback looked up at her. "You know we're not supposed to leave this corridor." "I know." She walked to the bay doors. There was a narrow observation window at head height, standard in this corridor, designed for exactly this purpose but for authorized staff only. Through it, she could see the surgical field. Mathers was at the table. The other surgeons were working around him, and the specific geometry of their positions told her that they had addressed the chest injury. The dressing on that side had been replaced with a surgical field drape and were currently focused on the left shoulder. The monitors were visible from this angle. The blood pressure reading was 68/41. That was not a post-surgery stabilization number. That was a patient who was still losing blood faster than it could be replaced. They were treating the shoulder. The neck bruising from this angle was visible above the surgical drape, still spreading, slow but spreading. Nora's hand was on the door handle before she had made a conscious decision. The door opened into the bay with the specific hydraulic resistance of a secured medical door, heavy, deliberate, designed to prevent accidents. She pushed through it. Every head in the room turned. Mathers looked up from the surgical field with an expression that she could not have described in a single word. It was composed of several things simultaneously: shock, offense, and the particular controlled fury of someone who had just been interrupted in the middle of a life-or-death procedure by a person with absolutely no standing to be in this room. "Whitaker." His voice was very quiet. "You have approximately 4 seconds to explain what you're doing in my OR before I have you removed from this facility permanently." Nora's eyes went to the monitors, then to the bruising on the general's neck, then back to Mathers. "You're treating the shoulder," she said. "Get her out of—" "The bleed isn't in the shoulder. It's not in the chest either. You've already addressed that, and his pressure is still dropping." She moved 2 steps closer. The surgical nurses shifted, uncertain. "Look at the anterior neck margin, high left side. That bruising pattern is being produced by something that's compressing the vessel from inside. It's still spreading, which means whatever it is, it moved during transport. You have a secondary foreign body." Silence. Not the silence of people who had stopped to consider what she'd said, the silence of people who had been too surprised to respond yet. Mathers straightened. "I have been a trauma surgeon for—" "I know who you are," Nora said, "and I know this is your OR, but his pressure has been dropping for 57 minutes, and it's going to keep dropping until you address what's pressing against that carotid." She held his gaze. "Run the imaging. If I'm wrong, you lose 4 minutes. If I'm right, you still have a window." The monitor chose that moment to spike an alarm. The blood pressure hitting a new floor, the machine expressing its concern in the only language it had. Mathers looked at the monitor. He looked at the neck. He looked at Nora with an expression she couldn't fully read, something that was still angry and had become, beneath the anger, something else, something uncertain. "Get the portable ultrasound," he said. Not to her, to the room. Nobody moved for half a second. Then one of the surgical nurses broke for the equipment station. Nora stepped back. She was not a surgeon. This was not her table. What happened in the next 4 minutes was going to happen with or without her presence, and her presence was going to become a problem the moment the shock in this room converted back into institutional authority. She knew that. She also knew what the ultrasound was going to show. She stood very still at the edge of the room and watched Mathers take the probe from the nurse and apply it to the general's neck. And she watched his face as the image resolved on the portable screen, and she watched the precise moment when Reginald Mathers, 24 years of military medicine, lowest complication rates in the Alliance, understood that the civilian staff nurse, 2 from Ohio, was right. He didn't look at her. He was already moving, already repositioning, already calling for the instruments he needed. His voice had found its certainty again, but it was running on a different track now. Recalculated, redirected, oriented toward a new target. Microforceps, and I need that field clear. The team responded. The room compressed into focused action. Nora remained at the edge of it, watching the monitor, watching the numbers, watching the neck. The door behind her opened. A security officer stepped through, took in the scene, and started moving toward her, then stopped when he saw the table, the instruments, the angle of Mathers's attention. The security officer looked at Nora. Nora looked at the monitor. The blood pressure held at 66/39. It had not dropped further in the last 90 seconds. The team was finding what she had told them to look for, and they were finding it faster than they would have otherwise. And that difference, those minutes, was doing something measurable on the screen above the table. The security officer did not remove her. He stood to the side and waited, and Nora stood at the edge of a room where she had no clearance, no rank, no invitation, and watched 25 military physicians work to undo the thing that 25 military physicians had missed, while the monitor climbed, one agonizing digit at a time, toward a number that a living body could sustain. The blood pressure hit 74/46, and Mathers didn't stop moving. He worked with the microforceps in the narrow space beneath the general's left clavicle, his hands making small, deliberate adjustments that looked almost gentle from a distance. The surgical field was tight. Too much equipment, too many bodies working in too little space, but the team had found its rhythm again after the first few seconds of recalibration, and now the room had the specific compressed energy of people who understood what they were doing and why it mattered. Nora stayed at the edge of it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The security officer at the door had made a decision somewhere in the last 4 minutes. She could see it in the way he'd repositioned himself, no longer angled toward her, but toward the door itself. Whatever he'd been sent in to do, he'd put it on hold. Whether that was his own call or something he'd read in the room, she didn't know and didn't spend time thinking about. The monitor climbed. 76/48, then 79. "There," Mathers said. Quiet, almost to himself. The instrument came up. Nested in the forceps grip was a piece of metal roughly the size of a broken pencil tip. Irregular edges, dark with oxidation except where fresh blood had coated it. It had been sitting against the vessel wall for however long the general had been in transit, held in place by muscle and compressed tissue, dislodged just enough during the helicopter transport to begin its slow work. One of the attending surgeons, Coach Dr. Ortiz, who had been in this room for the entire 57 minutes and had not left for a break or a breath of fresh air, let out something that was not quite a word, just a sound. The kind a person makes when a thing that was very close to going permanently wrong has chosen, at the last possible moment, not to. "Pressure's climbing," the anesthesiologist said. 82/51. Mathers set the fragment in a specimen tray and didn't look at it again. He was already assessing the repair site, already thinking about what came next. That was the thing about him. Whatever else he was good at this. The anger and the institutional rigidity and the 24 years of being the most qualified person in any room he entered, none of that disappeared when the crisis hit. He just pointed it at the problem. Nora could respect that even when she couldn't respect the rest of it. He didn't look at her for another 6 minutes. Not until the pressure had stabilized at 91/58 and the immediate surgical field was under control and the anesthesiologist had taken the monitors off the critical alarm threshold. Then he turned. The expression on his face was not an apology. It wasn't gratitude either. It was something more complicated than either of those things. A man running a very fast internal accounting, tallying what had just happened against what he'd believed before it happened, and not yet finished with the math. "Escort Nurse Whitaker to the consultation room," he said, "to nobody in particular. And keep the bay sealed. Nobody talks about what happened in this room until I've spoken with Commander Bryce." The consultation room was small and beige and had the specific smell of a space that existed primarily to receive bad news. There was a table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard that hadn't been used recently enough to erase the ghost lines of something from months ago. Nora sat in one of the chairs and waited. Nobody brought her water. Nobody explained how long this would take. The door closed behind the escort, and she heard the click of a magnetic lock engaging. Not aggressive, just the building's standard security protocol for any restricted personnel situation. She was not technically under arrest. She was also not free to leave. She folded her hands on the table and looked at the whiteboard. 20 minutes passed. She thought about the general's face, gray and still on the gurney. She thought about the piece of metal in the specimen tray. She thought about the specific trajectory that had brought a fragment of battlefield debris to a vessel wall in a man's neck, and the chain of decisions, made in a helicopter, made during field triage, made in this building over the course of 57 minutes, that had nearly let it finish what it had started. She also thought about what came next for her, which was less clean. She had walked into a restricted OR without authorization. She had interrupted an active surgery. She had directly contradicted the assessment of the facility's chief trauma surgeon in front of his entire team. The fact that she had been right was not going to make the paperwork simpler. In certain institutional contexts, being right in the wrong way was worse than being wrong quietly. She knew this. The door opened at the 23-minute mark. Commander Diane Bryce entered the room, the way people enter rooms when they've been moving fast for a while and have just forced themselves to slow down. She was in her late 40s, trim, with the kind of short hair that said she'd stopped thinking about it years ago and hadn't missed it. Her rank insignia put her at the top of the facility's administrative command structure. She had a tablet in one hand and a closed expression that gave away nothing. Behind her came Mathers, and behind Mathers, which Nora had not expected, came Lieutenant Colonel Drummond, still in the same suit she'd been wearing during her assessment rotation, her small leather notebook in her jacket pocket. 3 people in a room this size was a specific kind of pressure. Nora kept her hands on the table. Bryce pulled out a chair across from her and sat down without ceremony. "I'm going to ask you some questions, Nurse Whitaker, and I'd like direct answers." "Of course." "How did you identify the secondary injury?" Nora was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain of the answer, but because the answer had layers that the question hadn't asked for, and she was deciding how many layers to give. The bruising on the anterior neck had a distribution pattern inconsistent with blunt impact. It was spreading during transport, which meant it was active. Something was applying ongoing pressure. The blood pressure wasn't responding to treatment of the primary injuries, which meant the bleed wasn't coming from where they were looking. That's a significant diagnostic inference from an observation through a corridor window. "Yes." "Walk me through your reasoning." She did, cleanly, without editorializing, the way she'd learned to debrief, lay out what you observed, what it suggested, what you decided. Bryce listened without interrupting. Mathers stood to the side with his arms crossed and his face doing something she still couldn't fully categorize. Drummond took no notes, which meant she was memorizing. When Nora finished, Bryce looked at the tablet, then at Mathers. "Colonel?" Mathers uncrossed his arms. He directed his gaze at a point slightly above Nora's head, which was, she suspected, about as much of an accommodation as he was capable of in this particular moment. The assessment was correct. The fragment was located approximately where she indicated. Removal stabilized the patient. "And your assessment prior to her intervention?" A pause. 2 seconds. "We were addressing the presenting injuries in order of apparent severity." Bryce set the tablet down. "Nurse Whitaker, your placement documentation lists you as a credentialed trauma nurse with civilian ER experience. It doesn't list anything else. Is that documentation complete?" There it was. Nora had known this question was coming since the moment she walked through those OR doors. She had known it was a matter of when, not whether. The only variable had been who would be in the room when it arrived. She looked at Bryce. No, it's not complete. The air in the room shifted slightly. Drummond's hand moved toward her jacket pocket and then didn't quite reach the notebook. What's missing from it? Bryce asked. Prior to my nursing certification, I completed a 4-year service commitment with the 19th Combat Surgical Support Battalion. I cross-trained as a battlefield trauma specialist in the 2nd year. I was attached to forward surgical teams in 2 operational theaters over the following 18 months. She said it evenly. When I separated, I transitioned to civilian nursing. I didn't include the service history in my placement documentation because I was applying for a civilian nursing role and the prior service wasn't relevant to the certification. The silence that followed had a different texture than the one before. It was the silence of 3 people rapidly revising a calculation they'd thought was finished. Mathers looked at her directly, for the first time since he'd left the OR. His expression had resolved into something she recognized, the specific look of a person who has made a significant error in categorization and is not yet sure whether to be angry about it or embarrassed. He went with neither. Why didn't you disclose this earlier? Nobody asked. It landed in the room the way true things sometimes do. Not dramatically, just accurately, with the particular weight of something that doesn't need to be embellished to make its point. Bryce picked up the tablet again. She was quiet for a long moment. I need to verify your service record. I can provide my separation papers and unit documentation. We'll pull them through channels. She stood. In the meantime, you're to remain on facility grounds. Your ward assignment is suspended pending review. She looked at Drummond. Lieutenant Colonel, I'd like your assessment on file by end of shift. Drummond nodded once. Bryce left. The door didn't lock this time. Mathers moved toward the door, then stopped. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, and Nora watched his shoulders. The specific mechanics of a person deciding whether to say something they hadn't planned to say. He turned part way. Not all the way. The monitoring protocol on level 1 cases, he said. We run standard triage sequencing. Primary injuries first, secondary scan after stabilization. A pause. If the patient had been stable enough to survive the standard sequence, we would have found the fragment. I know, Nora said. I'm not explaining. He stopped. Started again. The sequencing is wrong. For this type of injury profile, it's wrong. She hadn't expected that. It landed differently than anything else he'd said to her in 6 weeks. I know, she said again, more quietly. He left without looking at her again. The door closed on its own this time, no lock. Drummond was still in the room. She had stayed through the whole thing without saying a word, which Nora now understood had been entirely deliberate. The positioning when you work, Drummond said. It wasn't from watching the surgical staff. No. Drummond nodded slowly. She pulled the leather notebook from her pocket, opened it to a page near the back, and wrote something. Then she closed it. The assessment report I file tonight is going to be factual and specific. I want you to understand that. I do. It's going to note what happened in that room, and it's going to note the sequence of events that preceded it, and it's going to note the facility's triage protocol. She put the notebook back in her pocket. What it cannot do is determine what happens to you after that. That's above my clearance level. She left. Nora sat alone in the consultation room for a while, not because she had to. The door wasn't locked, but because she needed a few minutes that didn't belong to anyone else. General Mercer Aldane was moved to a secured recovery suite on the 4th floor at 1340 hours. The transfer was handled with the controlled discretion that attended all movements of NATO personnel at this facility. Small team, cleared staff only, no public communication. His condition was listed internally as critical stable, which was the medical system's way of saying the worst had been avoided and the rest was going to be a long road. Nora learned this from Priya, who had been pulling a double and had caught the tail end of the transfer in the corridor outside the elevator bank. Words moving fast, Priya said. She was eating a granola bar in the way people eat when they're not thinking about eating, mechanically, in pieces. People know something happened in Bay 1 that didn't go the way it was supposed to go. Nobody knows what, but people know. How much are people saying? Enough. Too much, probably. Priya looked at her sideways. You okay? I'm suspended from ward assignment pending a record review. That's not what I asked. Nora thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things. She was tired. Not the tired of a long shift, but the tired of holding something for a long time in a posture that wasn't natural, and having it finally put down, and now feeling the ache of what that had cost. I think so, she said. Yeah. For what it's worth, Priya said, Travis saw you go into the bay. He says you moved like you knew exactly where you were going. I did. He also says he's never seen Mathers look like that. Like what? Priya considered. Like a man who just got corrected by someone he decided was furniture. Nora didn't respond to that. There wasn't much to say about it that the situation hadn't already said for itself. She spent the rest of the day in the holding pattern that a suspended assignment created. Not idle, exactly, because the facility's general nursing needs didn't pause for administrative review, and Delphine had quietly redirected her toward a documentation backlog that needed clearing. It was the kind of work that said, we still need your hands, but we can't officially need your expertise right now, which was a compromise that suited nobody entirely. She was updating discharge records at 17:20 when her badge reader pinged with a restricted access notification. She looked at the device. It was a request for her presence on the 4th floor, Suite 4C. She looked at the request code. It was marked with a gold band authorization she had never seen on her badge before. She went. Suite 4C was at the end of a corridor that required a separate key card to enter, and had 2 uniformed personnel standing outside the door who checked her badge, her ID, and her face against something on a handheld reader before stepping aside. Inside, the room was configured as a high-priority medical suite, monitoring equipment, 2 nurses she didn't recognize who were clearly cleared at a level above general staff, a physician she'd seen in passing but never worked with. The room smelled of antiseptic and the particular recycled air of a space that had its own ventilation system. General Mercer Aldane was awake. He was propped against 2 pillows, and he looked like a man who had been told what had happened to him over the last several hours and was still doing the math on what that meant. His face had color in it again. Not good color, the kind of yellow-gray that followed significant blood loss, but present, which was the only requirement at this stage. His eyes were clear. One of the unknown nurses stepped forward. He requested to see you. We're going to need to keep it brief. Nora moved to the side of the bed. She wasn't sure what to do with her hands. She settled for keeping them at her sides. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. His voice, when it came, was rougher than it would normally be. The aftermath of intubation, plus the simple reality of a body that had been pushed close to its limit. You're the nurse? Yes, sir. You walked into my surgery? Yes, sir. Mathers tells me I would have been dead in another 8 minutes. She didn't correct the phrasing. His team did the repair. I just redirected their attention. That's a modest way to describe it. He studied her with the eyes of someone who had spent a career reading people in high-pressure environments and had gotten reasonably good at it. What's your name? Whitaker. Nora Whitaker. Where'd you learn to see what you saw? The question was simple and enormous at the same time. She thought about all the places the honest answer went, the places she had been, and the things she had done there, the people who hadn't made it out of those places, the specific education that fieldwork delivers in a language that no classroom replicates. She thought about the door she'd closed on that life, and the reasons she'd had for closing it. Somewhere else, she said. He nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they understand that an answer is also a boundary. Fair enough. A monitor beside the bed produced a soft tone. Nothing alarming, just the system marking a threshold. One of the unknown nurses moved toward it. The general's eyes stayed on Nora. I'm going to want to know more about you, Nurse Whitaker, he said, when I'm better positioned to ask the right questions. She held his gaze. I understand. She left the suite, passed back through the corridor checkpoint, and walked back toward the main building with her badge in her hand and the specific knowledge that whatever the administrative review was going to uncover had just become significantly more complicated than a personnel file. Because there were people in this building now, people with the authority to look, who were going to start looking, and what they were going to find was not going to fit the box that anyone at Callaway Ridge had already put her in. The badge reader on her hip pinged again. Different code this time. Not gold band. Something she'd never seen before. A designation that wasn't in the standard staff directory, attached to a room number on sub-level 2 that wasn't on any public floor plan. She stared at the device for 3 seconds. Then she started walking. Sub-level 2 was not on the staff orientation map. Nora had received the map during her first week. A laminated fold-out that covered every floor of Callaway Ridge from the rooftop HVAC access to the basement supply storage. She had studied it the way she studied most things. Once, thoroughly, and then filed it in the part of her memory that didn't need to be accessed consciously. Sub-level 2 was not on it. There was a sub-level 1, mechanical systems, backup generators, the cold storage units for the pathology department. Below that, according to the official map, was foundation. The elevator required a key card she didn't have. She stood in front of it for 3 seconds, then looked at the badge reader on her hip again. The designation code was still there, attached to the room number, and below it was a secondary string she hadn't noticed the first time. An authorization override, temporary, time-stamped 14 minutes ago. Somebody had cleared her to go down before she'd even seen the ping. She pressed the elevator call button. It opened immediately. Inside, there was no sub-level 2 button on the standard panel, just a secondary reader mounted below the main controls, the kind that accepted restricted access credentials. She held her badge to it. The panel registered the code. A button appeared that hadn't been there before, and she pressed it, and the elevator descended past sub-level 1 without stopping. The doors opened onto a corridor that was nothing like the building above it. Above, Callaway Ridge ran on fluorescent, buzz, and beige paint, and the institutional smell of a medical facility trying to contain the reality of what it dealt with. Down here, the lighting was recessed and deliberate. The walls were a matte gray that absorbed rather than reflected, and the sound, or rather the lack of it, had a specific quality that came from acoustic dampening. Whatever happened in this corridor was not meant to travel. There were 4 doors. The second one had a small light above the frame that was green rather than red, which she read as the door she was meant to use. She pushed it open. The room was set up as a briefing space, not medical, not administrative. A rectangular table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted display screen currently showing a satellite map of what appeared to be a mountainous region with 3 colored overlay zones. At the table sat 2 people she had never seen before, both in civilian clothes that had the specific anonymous quality of clothes selected not to communicate anything about the person wearing them. One was a woman in her early 50s, dark-haired, with the stillness of someone who spent a great deal of time in rooms waiting for people to arrive. The other was a man about 10 years younger with a tablet in front of him and a pen he was clicking methodically. Standing to the side, not sitting, was Lieutenant Colonel Drummond. Nora stopped in the doorway. "Close the door," the dark-haired woman said, not unkindly, just as a statement of what needed to happen next. Nora closed it. "Sit down, Nurse Whitaker." The woman gestured to the chair across from her. "My name is Hargrove. This is Specialist Tan. We work for an oversight office that doesn't require further introduction at this stage. You've already met Lieutenant Colonel Drummond." She paused. "How much of your service record do you want to tell us before we pull it?" Nora sat. She looked at the satellite map on the wall for a moment. The overlay zones, the topography, the small alphanumeric markers that meant things she wasn't going to be briefed on. "How much do you already have?" "We have your separation papers, your unit assignment, and your cross-training designation." Hargrove folded her hands on the table. "We have a commendation from your forward surgical team commander that was filed and then classified at a level your separation rank wouldn't normally generate. We have a gap in your service record between month 19 and month 26 of your commitment that is redacted at a classification 2 levels above what your unit assignment would justify." 7 months. She hadn't expected them to find the gap that fast. "What do you want to know, Wassas?" Nora said. "What happened in those 7 months?" The man, Tan, stopped clicking his pen. Nora looked at Hargrove. "That information requires a clearance level I don't know your office holds." "We hold it," Drummond said. From the side of the room, quiet, not an interruption. just a confirmation. The satellite map on the wall cycled. One of the colored overlay zones changed. Nora looked at it and then looked away. I was attached to a joint evaluation team operating in a non-permissive environment. The team's function was to assess and stabilize high-value casualties in situations where conventional medical evacuation wasn't possible. I served as the primary trauma specialist for 14 months total, including the redacted period. The gap specifically, Hargrove said. A beat. The gap specifically covers 3 operations that are still active classification. I'm not going to describe them. We're not asking you to. Hargrove leaned back slightly. We're asking because we need to understand your capability profile, not your operational history. There's a difference. Why do you need my capability profile? Hargrove and Tan exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but contained a full conversation. Then Hargrove reached forward and touched something on the tabletop. A control panel Nora hadn't noticed. And the satellite map changed. The topography shifted to something she recognized, though she couldn't have said why immediately. The overlay zones were different now. There was a single red marker, stationary, in the center of a valley feature. General Aldane was not the target of an opportunistic attack, Hargrove said. The engagement that produced his injuries was a deliberate operation. 2 additional members of his command team were killed. A third is currently unaccounted for. She paused on that word just long enough to give it weight. We believe the operation was coordinated from inside an alliance structure. We are currently 41 hours into an active investigation, and we have a secondary casualty situation developing that we did not anticipate. Tan spoke for the first time. His voice was lower than she'd expected, precise. There's a second patient incoming. Estimated arrival 4 hours from now. NATO clearance Alpha 1, which is a level above General Aldane's designation. The injuries are reported as significant. Our primary trauma surgeon is Colonel Mathers. He paused. Who has been awake for 19 hours? Nora held very still. We're not asking you to replace Mathers, Hargrove said. Well, he'll be in the room. But given what happened today, we want someone with your specific background in that room with a status that reflects your actual capability, not your placement documentation. She looked at Nora directly. That requires you to disclose your full service record and accept a temporary elevated clearance designation. It also requires you to understand that what I'm about to tell you about the incoming patient does not leave this room. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the acoustic dampening, a ventilation system breathed steadily. What's the nature of the secondary injuries? Nora asked. Tan turned his tablet around. There was a field report on the screen, partial, with significant redactions, but enough. She scanned it in the way she read things, fast, the important words first, the structure second. Blast exposure, compression injury to the thoracic cavity, possible internal hemorrhage, field stabilization achieved but deteriorating during transport. The same attack, she said. The same attack, Hargrove confirmed. She looked at the map, the red marker in the valley, the transport route that wasn't marked but that she could extrapolate from the topography and the timeline. They're going to hit the transport. The room became a different kind of quiet. What makes you say that? Tan asked. His voice had a new register, not skeptical, interested in a specific way. If the attack on Aldane was coordinated from inside an alliance structure, whoever ran it knows Aldane survived. They know this facility treated him. A second Alpha 1 patient from the same engagement coming to the same facility is an intelligence problem for them. She looked at the transport route she'd constructed in her head. If I were trying to prevent the second patient from reaching this building, I'd hit the transport in the valley section. The terrain narrows, there's no alternate route. Hargrove and Tan were both looking at her. Drummond said very quietly, "She's right about the terrain." Hargrove picked up a secure phone from the tabletop. She dialed without looking at the number. "This is Hargrove. I need a security assessment on the Alpha 1 transport route, specifically the valley egress." "Yes, now." She set the phone down. "We're going to need you briefed and cleared in the next 2 hours. Can you do that?" Nora thought about the badge reader in her pocket, the elevated code that had been waiting for her before she'd even decided to walk toward this elevator. She thought about the 7 months that were redacted in her file, and the reasons they were redacted, and the people who had made that call. She thought about the man on the fourth floor with yellow-gray skin and clear eyes who had said, "I'm going to want to know more about you," in the tone of someone who already knew more than he'd said. "Yes," she said. The briefing took 94 minutes. By the end of it, Nora had a temporary clearance designation that felt strange, against her civilian ID the way a coat belonging to someone else feels. Functional, but not quite fitted. She had the names and injury profiles of the incoming patient and the 2 security personnel accompanying him. She had the layout of Trauma Bay 1 overlaid with the specific protocol adjustments that Hargrove's office had requested for Alpha 1 cases. She had a radio frequency that was not in the facility's standard communication directory. She also had a significant problem, which was Mathers. He didn't know she was going to be in that room. He'd been told, she assumed, that the civilian nurse from Ward C who had walked into his OR that morning was undergoing administrative review. He had not been told, as far as she could determine, that the same nurse was going to be standing next to him in 4 hours with a clearance level that temporarily matched his. She found out she'd assumed correctly when she walked into the pre-op preparation area at 2100, and Mathers turned from the instrument table and looked at her with an expression that moved through several phases in rapid succession before settling on something that was doing its best to be professional. "Nobody told me," he said. "I know." "Hargrove's office?" "Yes." He turned back to the instrument table. He picked up a retractor, examined it unnecessarily, put it back. "Your background?" "Yes." "The 19th CSSB." He said the unit designation in a way that indicated he'd already looked it up, which meant he'd had about 2 hours with the information. "Cross-trained trauma specialist. Forward surgical attachment." He paused. "There's a redaction in the record." "There is." He didn't ask about it. She gave him credit for that. "What do you need from me?" The question surprised her, not because it was wrong, but because the version of Mathers she had spent 6 weeks constructing in her mind hadn't been built to produce that question. She adjusted. "The same thing you needed from your team this morning," she said, "for someone to say something if they see something." He held her gaze for a moment. "That's fair." He moved to the next station. "The patient's thoracic compression is going to be our primary concern. The field report said the hemorrhage was partially controlled, but the imaging they transmitted shows fluid accumulation on the left lobe. We go in expecting a pleural bleed and prepare for the possibility it's communicating with the pericardial space." "Agreed," she said, "but I want an ultrasound at the table before we open." "Standard protocol." "Not for this injury profile. The field stabilization used a technique that can mask a communicating bleed on initial assessment. I want baseline imaging before we see anything else." He looked at her. "You've seen this before." Not a question. "Once," she said, and left it there, because that was where it needed to stay. He nodded. "Ultrasound at the table. I'll add it to the pre-op brief." The transport was 40 minutes out when the radio on Nora's hip, the one on the non-standard frequency, produced 2 short tones that meant something had changed. She was in the prep area running through the surgical arrangement with one of the cleared nurses when it went off, and she stepped into the corridor and keyed the device. Tan's voice. "Transport is reporting a secondary contact, valley egress, as projected. Security team is engaged. ETA is now uncertain. They're rerouting." She keyed back. "What's the patient's current status?" "Stable as of 15 minutes ago. Field medic on board. But the reroute adds distance, and they've been jostled." She knew what jostled meant for a thoracic compression patient with a partially controlled bleed. "How much distance?" 22 minutes additional? Best case." She went back into the prep area. Mathers was reviewing the transmitted imaging on the wall screen. She moved to stand beside him and said low, "They're rerouting. We have 22 minutes added to the window. The patient may arrive in worse shape than the last report." He absorbed this without reacting visibly. "What's your read on the bleed progression with that additional time?" "If it's communicating with the pericardial space, we're going to see tamponade symptoms on arrival. Hypotension, muffled tones, distended neck veins." She paused. "We should have a pericardiocentesis kit at the table." He was quiet for 3 seconds. "That's an aggressive preposition." "Yes." Another 2 seconds. "Set it up," he said. She turned to the cleared nurse, a woman named Voss, efficient and quiet. who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone calibrating exactly how to read the dynamic in the room. Pericardiocentesis kit. Long needle setup. I want it covered, but accessible. Voss moved without asking follow-up questions. Nora noted that and filed it. The next 22 minutes were the specific kind of slow that happens when preparation is complete, and all that's left is waiting for something that you cannot control to arrive. Nora checked the instrument layout twice. She reviewed the imaging one more time. She stood at the edge of the bay and thought about thoracic anatomy and the specific ways it fails and the specific windows in which it can be corrected, and she did not think about the valley egress or the security team engaged there, or what it meant that someone inside the Alliance had tried to prevent this patient from reaching this building. The radio produced a single long tone at 21:47. Transport inbound. 3 minutes. The bay doors opened at 21:51. The gurney came through fast, faster than the Aldane transport, which had at least had the benefit of a functional blood pressure on arrival. This patient was breathing, which was the most optimistic thing that could be said immediately. He was a man in his mid-60s, broad-faced, and the field dressing on his left chest had been changed at least twice based on the layering visible at the edges. His neck veins were visible from 4 feet away. Nora was already at the table. "Distended neck veins," she said. To Mathers, to the room, muffled on left side. She had the stethoscope on his chest before the gurney had fully stopped moving. "We have tamponade. Beck's triad. We need the pericardiocentesis kit open now." Mathers was on the opposite side. His hands were already moving. "Confirm on ultrasound." Voss had the machine at the table in the time it took for that exchange to conclude. Mathers took the probe himself, applied it to the chest, and the screen showed exactly what a pericardial effusion looks like. A dark crescent of fluid compressing the heart from the outside, the chambers working harder with each beat against the pressure. "Confirmed," he said. "Nora." She had the needle in her hand. He had used her first name without noticing he'd done it, which told her something about the state of his attention. All of it on the patient, none left over for institutional hierarchy. That was the right state for this room. She positioned the needle at the subxiphoid angle, 17 degrees, the specific geometry of a procedure she had performed under conditions considerably less controlled than this. The patient was unconscious. The monitor showed his pressure at 61/38. "On your mark," she said, to Mathers. "Go," he said. The needle advanced. She felt the resistance change as it passed through the pericardium, the specific give of a membrane yielding to the correct angle of approach. Dark, non-pulsatile blood entered the syringe, which was exactly what she needed to see, because pulsatile blood would mean she was in the ventricle, which would be a different kind of crisis. "Non-pulsatile," she said. "We're in the pericardial space." She withdrew 40 cubic centimeters, then 60. On the monitor, the pressure began a slow, incremental climb, 64/41, then 68. "Keep going," Mathers said quietly. He was watching the monitor with his arms at his sides, deliberately not touching anything that wasn't his to touch in this moment. She drew another 30 cubic centimeters. The pressure hit 74/47. The neck veins flattened slightly. The monitor's alarm threshold stepped down 1 level. "Hold," Mathers said. She held. They stood in the specific silence of a procedure that is working and might continue to work if nobody makes a wrong decision in the next 30 seconds. Then the second monitor, the one tracking the thoracic drainage, produced an alarm she hadn't heard before. Voss moved to it, read the display, and said, "Chest tube output is increasing. We've got an active pleural bleed." Of course, because the tamponade had been suppressing the bleed, the external pressure on the heart had also been reducing perfusion to the left lobe, which had slowed the hemorrhage. Now that the tamponade was partially relieved, the heart was pumping with more force, and that force was feeding directly into the bleeding vessel. Mathers looked at her across the table. "We go in," she said. "We go in," he agreed. The room reconfigured in the fast, practiced way that trauma teams reconfigure when the plan has changed and everyone understands what the new plan is and there is no time to explain it. Instruments moved. The anesthesiologist made adjustments. Voss was already preparing the thoracoscopic setup. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the door at the far end of the bay opened. Not the supply access, not the corridor entrance, but the emergency egress door that was supposed to require a physical key to open from outside. And a man in a Callaway Ridge maintenance uniform came through it at a speed that was not consistent with maintenance activity. Nora saw him before anyone else in the room did. She saw his hands, and what his right hand was holding, and the angle of his body, and all of it resolved in less than a second into a conclusion that bypassed the part of her brain that asked whether she was sure. "Down," she said, and she was already moving, not away from the table, but toward the angle that put her between the man and the patient, because the patient was open on a surgical table and could not be moved, and everything else in this room was secondary to that fact. The security officer stationed inside the bay, a position she hadn't known was there until this moment, which meant Hargrove had added it after the conversation in sub-level 2, came off the wall at the same time she moved, and the two of them converged on the man from different angles, and the thing in his right hand hit the floor before it could do what it had been brought here to do. The bay erupted. Mathers, to his complete credit, did not step back from the table. He stayed exactly where he was, hands in position, body shielding the surgical field with the same deliberate stillness he brought to every procedure. "Continue," he said, to the room, to nobody specific, to everyone. "We continue." Nora turned back to the table with her heart running at a pace that she could feel in her fingertips and her throat and the backs of her teeth. And she looked at Mathers across the open chest of a man whose life was currently balanced on the next several decisions they were going to make together. He met her eyes. "Where were we?" he said. The monitor alarm was still going. The pleural bleed was still active. The security officer had the man in the maintenance uniform on the floor and was calling for backup on a radio that was producing too much noise in a room that needed quiet. She picked up the instrument in her hand and found the vessel and said with a steadiness that she had not felt this clearly in years, "We were here." The pleural bleed was a branch off the left pulmonary vein, not the main vessel, which would have made the next 4 minutes considerably shorter and worse, but a secondary tributary that had been partially sealed by the field dressing and had now reopened with the restored cardiac output. Nora found it by feel as much as by sight. The instruments moving in the space between the ribs with the precision that came from having done this kind of work in places where the lighting was considerably worse and the table was considerably less stable. She clamped it, held, waited for the monitor to confirm what her hands were telling her. "Output's dropping on the chest drain," Voss said. "Pressure is 79/52 and climbing." Mathers was working the pericardial side, maintaining the drainage catheter position while the heart steadied itself. He didn't look up. Neither did she. The security officer in the corner had the man in the maintenance uniform restrained and had stopped producing radio noise after a sharp look from Mathers that had communicated something concisely without using words. 2 more minutes. The pressure hit 84/55. The monitor stepped down another alarm threshold. The room came off its highest pitch of tension and settled into something that was still urgent but no longer immediate. The difference between a fire being fought and a fire that has peaked and is now being managed. "Suture," Nora said. Voss had it ready. Of course she did. The repair took 11 minutes. Not clean. There was a secondary bleed point adjacent to the first that revealed itself once the primary was addressed. The kind of complication that wasn't a mistake, just the body's refusal to present its problems in a convenient sequence. Mathers caught it before she did, which she registered without ego because that was the correct way to register it. They worked around each other with the particular adaptation of two people who have not practiced together, but who understand the same language and are both currently focused on the same thing. When the chest was closed and the drain output had slowed to a rate consistent with surgical trauma rather than active hemorrhage, Nora stepped back from the table and felt the full weight of the last 4 hours hit her legs at once. She locked her knees, breathed once through her nose, and stayed standing. Mathers pulled off his outer gloves and looked at the monitors for a long moment. The patient's pressure was holding at 91/61. Not good, but sustained. Good enough. "Post-op ICU," he said. "Full monitoring, cleared staff only. I want imaging every 2 hours." He paused. "Good work." He said it to the room. But he was looking at her when he said it. She nodded once. Then she looked at the corner where the security officer was standing over the man in the maintenance uniform, who was now zip-tied and sitting against the wall with the specific expression of someone whose plan has concluded in a way that was not part of the original design. "Who called it in?" she asked. "You did," the security officer said, 30 seconds earlier than I would have. She looked at the emergency egress door, still open, the external corridor visible beyond it. A physical key. Someone had given that man a physical key to a restricted trauma bay during an active surgery on a NATO Alpha 1 patient. That key came from somewhere, which meant it had been issued to someone, which meant the chain between those two facts led somewhere specific and institutional. Hargrove was going to want to know where. The debrief began at 0:30 and ran for 2 hours and 17 minutes. It was held in sub-level 2 again, but the room was different this time, larger, with more people at the table. Hargrove was present. Tan was present. Drummond was present. There were 3 additional personnel whose names she wasn't given and whose function she understood from their questions rather than their introductions. Commander Bryce arrived 40 minutes in, slightly breathless, with the look of someone who had been reached by phone and had driven here and was still assembling the full picture. Mathers was there too. He sat 2 seats down from Nora and drank bad coffee from a paper cup and answered questions with the same precision he brought to everything, and she noticed that he had stopped performing authority and was simply occupying space, which was a different thing. The maintenance worker's name was Carl Freed. He had been employed at Callaway Ridge for 8 months. His employment record was clean, his security clearance was standard for his role, and absolutely nothing in his files suggested that he should be in possession of an emergency egress key to a Level 1 trauma bay, or a device that was, according to the preliminary assessment Tan read from his tablet, a signal disruptor designed to interfere with medical monitoring equipment. Not a weapon, a disruptor, which meant the objective had not been to harm the patient directly. It had been to produce a controlled equipment failure during surgery that could be attributed to technical malfunction. Nora thought about that for a moment, about the precision of it, about the difference between someone who wanted a patient dead in an obvious way and someone who wanted a patient dead in a way that generated a report that said surgical complications rather than sabotage. "He was recruited," she said. Not a question. "Almost certainly," Hargrove confirmed. "He's not talking yet. He will." She said the last 2 words without elaboration that would have made them more alarming, which made them more alarming. "The egress key is the thread we're pulling. Physical key distribution at this facility runs through facilities management, which runs through an administrative office that has 3 staff members with the access level to authorize that key." "Who are they?" Bryce asked. Hargrove looked at her steadily. "That's what we're in the process of determining, Commander." Bryce absorbed this. She looked like a woman who was doing a rapid inventory of everyone she trusted in this building and finding the math uncomfortable. "How long have you known this facility was compromised?" "We've had indicators for 11 weeks, Hargrove said. "We did not have specifics until 41 hours ago." She paused. "Which is the reason for the civilian placement from the Interagency Corps." The room was quiet in a specific way. Nora kept her face still. Bryce turned to look at her. "You were placed here." "Yes." "By Hargrove's office." "I found that out tonight," Nora said, which was true, and was also a careful answer, and covered the fact that she had her own calculations about when things had been decided and who had decided them, and how much of the last 6 weeks had been as accidental as it appeared. Bryce looked at Hargrove. "You ran an operative inside my facility without informing me." "We ran an assessment resource inside your facility. The distinction matters." Hargrove's voice was even. "If we had informed you, we would have informed everyone you spoke to about it, which would have included whoever has been routing information out of this building for the past 11 weeks. The silence that followed that sentence had a texture. Bryce understood the implication. Everyone at the table understood it. The question of who had been leaking and what they had access to was now sitting in the room alongside the question of who in the administrative chain had authorized a key to a trauma bay egress. Bryce looked at Mathers. "Did you know?" He set down the coffee cup. "No, I did not." He looked at Nora. "Though I'd like to say for the record that it wouldn't have changed my behavior toward her even if I had." The way he said it made clear that he did not mean it as a compliment to himself. By 0300, Hargrove's team had identified 2 of the 3 administrative staff with key authorization accesses cleared. The third was a man named Vince Osley, a senior facilities coordinator who had been with Callaway Ridge for 6 years, and whose name appeared in 11 weeks of internal communication logs in proximity to scheduling information for Level 1 cases. Osley was not in the building. He had badged out at 18:30, 4 hours before the surgery, and had not returned. His personal vehicle was in the parking structure. His phone was going to voicemail. His apartment, according to the local field team Hargrove dispatched at 0245, was unlocked, lights on, coffee still warm on the counter. He had left in a hurry, which meant he'd known the operation was going to fail, which meant someone had told him. Nora was in the hallway outside the briefing room when Drummond found her at 0340. She was standing near the water fountain that didn't work particularly well, drinking from a paper cup and thinking about the warm coffee in Osley's apartment and what it meant about timing. "You should sleep," Drummond said. "Probably." Drummond stood beside her in the way people stand when they have something to say and are deciding how to say it. "The report I filed yesterday described your intervention in clinical terms. Today's events are going to require a supplemental. The supplemental is going to be more specific about your background and your role in both surgical interventions." "I understand." "What you may not fully understand yet is the scope of what that means for your assignment status." Drummond looked at the wall. "You came here as a staff nurse too. That designation is going to be revised, and the revision is going to be official and documented and visible to everyone in this facility's chain of command." Nora crushed the paper cup. "That's going to create problems." "Yes," Drummond agreed. "For some people it will. That's rather the point." She left without further explanation, which was becoming a pattern. Nora appreciated it more each time. The morning came the way mornings come after nights that have gone completely off their planned trajectory. Gray, indifferent, producing light without warmth. Nora had slept for 3 hours on a cot in the staff rest area, and woken with the specific clarity of someone whose body has processed what it needed to process and is now prepared to continue. She showered, changed, went to check on her ward patients because they still existed and still had needs that were not connected to NATO clearance or Sub-Level 2 or any of the events of the last 18 hours. The sergeant with the spinal plate had actually done his ankle rotations, according to the night nurse's notes, which was the most straightforwardly good thing she'd learned since the previous morning. At 800, Commander Bryce called a department-level meeting. This was not standard procedure for a Wednesday morning, and the fact that it wasn't standard procedure was visible in the faces of the assembled staff. About 40 people, ranging from department heads down to the civilian support staff, crowded into the main conference room on the second floor. There were people standing along the walls. The room smelled of coffee, and the particular tension of people who know something significant has happened and are waiting to be told what version of it they're going to receive officially. Bryce stood at the front with the posture of someone who has made a decision and has committed to it and is not going to spend time second-guessing it in public. Mathers was to her right. Drummond was present, which surprised some people in the room based on their expressions. She was not a regular presence at facility-wide briefings. Nora stood near the back, the masu. Last night, this facility treated 2 high-priority patients under circumstances that were not routine, Bryce began. "I'm not going to give you details that fall outside your clearance level. What I will tell you is that the care delivered in this building saved 2 lives, and that the events of the last 24 hours have initiated a review process that is going to produce significant changes to how this facility handles certain protocols." She paused. The room was very quiet. "I'm also going to tell you something that should have been said differently 6 weeks ago, and I'm saying it now because it needs to be part of the official record of this institution." She looked toward the back of the room, not dramatically, just directly. "Nurse Whitaker, would you come forward, please?" Nora walked through the crowd. People made space without quite meeting her eyes, the way people do when they know they're witnessing something they should have seen coming and didn't. She stopped next to Bryce. Bryce addressed the room. "Nurse Whitaker has been serving at this facility under a civilian placement designation that did not accurately reflect her background, training, or capability. That was a failure of documentation and intake process. and it resulted in this facility underutilizing a resource we didn't understand we had. She paused. More specifically, it resulted in members of the staff treating a qualified medical professional as an administrative assistant with good intentions. Nobody in the room moved. Effective today, her placement status is reclassified. The specific designation is pending security clearance formalization, but it reflects her actual background: 4 years of military service, advanced combat trauma certification, forward surgical team attachment in 2 operational theaters. Bryce looked at Nora directly. She performed 2 life-saving interventions in the last 24 hours, the first of which corrected a diagnostic error that would have been fatal within minutes. The word error landed in the room and stayed there. Mathers, to his left, did not flinch. He had known this sentence was coming. He had perhaps helped to write it. "I want to add something," he said. Bryce gave him the space. He looked at the assembled staff with the expression of a man who has been doing something a particular way for a very long time and has recently learned, at significant cost, that the way needs adjustment. "I dismissed Nurse Whitaker's observations repeatedly over the past 6 weeks. I did it because of her age and her placement designation, and I did it without examining either of those things as a basis for a judgment. Yesterday she walked into my OR and told me I was treating the wrong injury, and she was correct." He stopped. Let the sentence exist without adding anything to it. The lesson is not that we should have listened to her specifically. The lesson is that we have a structural problem with how we process information that comes from outside expected channels. I intend to address that through the protocol review that's now underway. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, Priya Sathuraman started clapping. It was not a dramatic gesture, she was not a dramatic person, but it was deliberate and it was real, and it lasted long enough that other people joined it. Nora did not know what to do with her face during this, which was probably visible to everyone in the room, but there was nothing to be done about it. 3 things happened over the following 6 hours that were not part of any briefing. The first, Carl Fried, the maintenance worker, spoke. He had been held in a secured room on sub-level 1 since the previous night, and by 1000 he had decided that whatever arrangement he'd made with whoever had recruited him was no longer a structural option he believed in. He gave a name. The name was not Vince Osley. Osley, it turned out, had been a secondary contact, someone recruited to handle physical logistics. The name Fried gave was a person with a significantly higher position in the facility's administrative structure, someone whose role gave them access to scheduling data, clearance rosters, and internal communications. The name was Dr. Pauline Gerst, Deputy Administrative Director, Callaway Ridge Military Medical Center. Hargrove's team cross-referenced the name against 11 weeks of internal communication logs in 40 minutes. The cross-reference produced 83 flagged communications, scheduling information, clearance designations, patient transfer details, routed through an external channel that had been designed to look like standard interagency data exchange and had been doing so successfully for 11 weeks. The second thing, General Aldane on the 4th floor in Suite 4C was briefed. Nora did not hear this briefing, but she understood its contours from the way Drummond walked after she came back from it, with a specific forward momentum that meant decisions had been made by someone with the authority to make them. The third thing was the thing that changed the shape of everything that came before it. At 1340, Nora was in the staff break room, actually eating something for the first time in almost 18 hours. A sandwich that she was not tasting because she was thinking about Osley's warm coffee and the 83 flagged communications and what it meant that Gerst had been in this building for 6 years, when Voss appeared in the doorway. "They need you in the administrative wing," Voss said. "Hargrove's team." Nora put the sandwich down and followed her. The administrative wing was on the 3rd floor, a section of the building she had visited exactly once during her orientation. It had carpet instead of linoleum and the smell of paper and ambient bureaucracy. Hargrove's people had set up in one of the larger offices, and when Nora arrived, she found 3 of them working at laptops around a conference table that had been converted into a workstation, cables running across the floor in the organized, chaotic way of a team that has been operational for a while and has stopped caring about aesthetics. Tan looked up. "Gerst requested to speak with you." Nora stopped walking. "With me, specifically." "By name, about 20 minutes ago." She looked at him. Why? She hasn't said. He paused. She's in the director's conference room. She's been in there since 1100, so we brought her in for questioning, and she's been cooperative on procedural matters, giving us access to documentation, but she's refused to discuss the intelligence pipeline until she speaks with you. Whatever Gerst was, she was not a person who made arbitrary requests. If she had asked for Nora specifically, she had a reason, and the reason was going to require something. Is she under arrest? Nora asked. Detention. Not formal arrest yet. That comes when the federal warrant clears, which should be within the hour. He looked at her steadily. You don't have to do this. I know. She thought about it for 3 seconds, which was enough time to determine that she wasn't going to make a useful decision without more information, and that not going into that room was itself a decision with consequences. What does she want to say to me? We won't know until you go in. The director's conference room was down the hall. There were 2 of Hargrove's personnel outside the door, not armed visibly, but positioned in the way that people position themselves when they are prepared to be. Nora stopped at the door. One of them nodded. She pushed it open. Pauline Gerst was in her early 60s, with steel-colored hair and the particular poise of a person who has held institutional authority for so long that it has become structural, present even in a room where she no longer held any. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table in a posture that could have been read as calm or as someone performing calm, and Nora couldn't tell which it was yet. Gerst looked at her for a moment. Close the door, she said. Nora closed it. She did not sit. You found something last night, Gerst said. In the OR, something that surprised you. That's not a specific enough statement for me to respond to. The device Freed brought in. Gerst's voice was even. It wasn't designed to kill the patient. You know that. I know that. Then you've been thinking about what it was designed to do. She looked at Nora with eyes that had the quality of someone accustomed to assessing people quickly. A monitoring disruption, controlled, during a specific window of the procedure. She paused. Do you know why that window? I've been thinking about it. Then you've probably arrived at the same place I have. Gerst unfolded her hands, set them flat on the table. The device wasn't targeting the patient. It was targeting the imaging system. She looked at Nora directly. The imaging system that was going to show, if the surgery had proceeded on standard protocol, something in that patient's chest that is not a surgical complication and is not related to his battlefield injuries. The room was very still. What is it? Nora said. Gerst looked at her for a long moment. The look of someone making a final calculation about a decision that once made cannot be unmade. Something that was placed there, she said. 6 weeks ago. During a routine procedure at a different facility. Something very small with a specific function. She paused. Something that, if it had been discovered in an official NATO surgical record last night, would have implicated people far above my position in this building. She held Nora's gaze. People who are currently running the investigation into what happened here. The air in the room did something complicated. I'm going to need you to pull the imaging from last night's surgery, Gerst said. The preoperative ultrasound. The baseline you insisted on before the procedure began. She said the last sentence with the precision of someone who had been watching and knew exactly what had happened in that room. Look at the lower left quadrant, below the pericardial margin. Nora looked at her for a long time. Gerst looked back without flinching. The warrant was coming within the hour. After that, Gerst would have a lawyer and a formal detention status, and this conversation would never have taken place in the same form again. Whatever she was telling Nora right now, she was telling her because this specific window existed and would not exist again. Nora turned and put her hand on the door. Whitaker, Gerst said. She stopped. The people running this investigation are not all on the same side, Gerst said quietly. Be careful which ones you trust with what you find. Nora walked out of the room, down the corridor, past Hargrove's team without stopping, and directly toward the imaging archive station on the second floor where last night's preoperative ultrasound was stored under a file number she had already memorized. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. The imaging archive station was a terminal in a recessed alcove off the second floor corridor, used primarily by attending physicians pulling post-op references and radiologists submitting reports into the central system. At 13:52 on a Wednesday afternoon, it was unoccupied. Nora sat down, entered her newly elevated access credentials. They worked, which still felt strange, and pulled up the surgical file from the previous night. The preoperative ultrasound was timestamped 21:43:08. She had been the one who insisted on it. She had stood at that table and told Mathers she wanted baseline imaging before they opened, and he had agreed, and Voss had brought the machine, and the whole exchange had taken less than 90 seconds because they had more urgent things to think about. She loaded the file. The imaging was standard resolution, the quality you get from a portable unit under field-adjacent conditions. Functional, sufficient, not elegant. She moved through the frames sequentially, the way she had been trained to move through imaging, not looking for what she expected to find, but looking at everything and letting anomalies surface on their own. She reached the lower left quadrant at frame 41. She stopped. She went back one frame, forward one frame, back to 41. It was small. If she hadn't been told exactly where to look, she would have noted it as a probable imaging artifact, a density variation at the inferior pericardial margin, roughly 4 millimeters in its longest dimension, too regular in shape to be organic tissue and too consistent across adjacent frames to be noise in the signal. It sat in the space between the pericardial wall and the left lobe of the liver with the specific stillness of something that had been placed rather than grown. She stared at it for a long time. Then she took a screenshot of frame 41, saved it to a separate file under her personal access folder, and sat back in the chair and thought about what Gerst had said, something that was placed there 6 weeks ago, during a routine procedure at a different facility. 4 millimeters, regular geometry, the kind of density signature that suggested a composite material, not purely metallic, which would have flagged on standard pre-procedure screening, but not organic. Something engineered to pass through a basic clearance scan and settle into a body cavity where it would be unremarkable on a routine examination. She thought about what Gerst had said next. People who are currently running the investigation into what happened here. She thought about Hargrove, about the way Hargrove had known things she shouldn't have known, unless she had been watching this facility for longer than 41 hours. About the temporary clearance designation that had been preloaded onto Nora's badge before she'd even received the ping. About the placement that had originated through Hargrove's office, which she had learned last night, and which she had accepted as information without yet fully examining what it implied about the 6 weeks before it. She thought about Drummond, who had noticed her hand positioning on the first day and said nothing for 3 weeks, and then shown up in a sub-level briefing room as if she'd always been there. She thought about General Aldane on the 4th floor, who had said, "I'm going to want to know more about you," in the tone of someone who already knew more than he'd said. She thought about the 7-month gap in her service record, the joint evaluation team, the 14 months of forward surgical work, the classification level that had surprised even Hargrove's office. Someone had placed her in this building, the question she hadn't yet asked, the question she had been too focused on the immediate crises to properly examine, was whether the person who had placed her here had done so because they needed her skills or because they needed something she didn't know she was carrying. She picked up her radio, the non-standard frequency. She keyed it. Tan answered in 2 seconds. "Whitaker." "I need to speak with Drummond," she said. "Not Hargrove. Drummond specifically. Can you locate her?" A pause. 3 seconds. "She's in the facility. Give me 5 minutes." She gave him 5 minutes. She sat at the terminal and looked at frame 41 and thought about the difference between being used as a tool and being trusted as a person, and how those two things could look identical from the outside for a very long time. Drummond found her in the alcove at 1411. She looked at the terminal screen, at frame 41. Her expression moved through something and then settled back into the precision that was its resting state. "You found it," Drummond said. "Gerst told me where to look." "I know. We monitor the conference room." She pulled a chair from the adjacent workstation and sat down without being invited, the gesture of someone who had decided formalities were no longer the most efficient use of the available time. "What do you want to know?" "How long have you known it was there?" Drummond looked at the image. "We identified a similar device in a separate patient 8 months ago. A courier, not a military official. someone used as a transit mechanism without their knowledge. The device was a passive data storage unit. It accumulated biometric and locational data and transmitted it in microbursts on a frequency that looks like cardiac monitor interference. She paused. The person we recovered it from didn't know it was there. They'd had a minor surgical procedure at a facility in Brussels 18 months prior. And you think Aldane's patient has the same type? The imaging signature matches. She looked at Nora directly. We've been trying to locate which NATO officials had procedures at the 3 facilities we identified as insertion points. It's been slow work because the procedures were routine. The documentation is distributed across multiple medical systems in 3 countries, and we couldn't flag the inquiry without alerting whoever is running the collection network. Which is why you needed someone inside this facility who could identify an anomaly in a surgical image without being briefed on what to look for. Nora kept her voice even. Someone who would insist on baseline imaging before a procedure. Drummond held her gaze. Yes. That's why I was placed here. Partly. What's the other part? The other part, Drummond said carefully, is that this facility has a leak, and we needed someone in it who couldn't be compromised through its existing communication channels because nobody in those channels knew who she was or what she was there for. She paused. You were the right person for both reasons. That's not a manipulation. It's an accurate statement about capability. Nora thought about that. She thought about the 6 weeks of being treated as furniture and whether any of that would have been different if Drummond had briefed her on day 1. She thought about whether she would have done what she did in that OR if she'd known she was being watched for it, and she decided the answer was yes, and that the answer being yes was the reason they'd chosen her. And that none of this made her feel particularly clean about any of it, but that feeling unclean about something and deciding it was wrong were 2 different calculations. What happens to the image? She asked. It goes to a secure evidence file under a classification that Hargrove's office doesn't administer, Drummond said. It goes to the NATO Inspector General's office directly, which is where it needed to go from the beginning and which Hargrove's office has been, deliberately or otherwise, routing around. Gerst said the people running the investigation aren't all on the same side. Gerst is correct about that. Drummond's voice was the same, but something behind it had sharpened, which is why I need you to send that image file from your personal access folder to the address I'm going to give you right now, before anyone in Hargrove's office looks at what you pulled from the archive. Nora looked at her. Drummond met her look steadily. I know I'm asking you to trust a chain of judgment that has already used your trust once without your full knowledge. I understand if that's a hard ask. It is, Nora said. I know. She thought about the 2 men on surgical tables and the fragment in the specimen tray, and the blood pressure climbing 1 painful digit at a time, and the security officer coming off the wall, and Mathers saying, "Where were we?" over an open chest with a monitor alarm still going. She thought about Priya eating a granola bar in the fluorescent light of a break room, explaining the math that people do without asking permission. She thought about what it meant to trust a chain of judgment, not a person, not an institution, but a direction, when all of the available options involved some degree of incomplete information. She turned back to the terminal. Drummond gave her the address. She sent the file. The arrests came at 1600, not Gerst's formal arrest, that had been processing since midday and completed without drama, 2 federal agents and a warrant and the specific paperwork of a thing that had been building for 11 weeks and was now concluding. That happened in the administrative wing with no audience. The arrests at 1600 were different. 2 of the 3 flagged communications in Hargrove's team's investigation had led to people outside the facility. The 3rd had led, through a routing pathway that Tan's digital forensics work had spent the better part of 12 hours unwinding, to a person inside it. Not Osley, not Gerst. Someone whose name had not appeared on anyone's preliminary list because they had been careful and because the access they'd used had been borrowed from someone else's credentials in increments too small to flag the automated monitoring. The name was Dr. Warren Selke, attending physician, orthopedic surgery, Callaway Ridge Military Medical Center. 11 years at the facility. A service record that included a deployment period with the timeline and a performance review that was clean in the way performance reviews are clean when someone is trying very hard to keep them clean. He was in the orthopedic clinic on the ground floor when Hargrove's people came for him, along with 2 federal agents and Commander Bryce, who had insisted on being present and had the expression of a woman who was holding her institutional composure together through force of will and would probably spend some time alone later not holding it together at all, which was entirely appropriate. Nora was not there for the arrest. She heard about it from Priya, who had heard it from Travis Weil, who had seen it happen through the clinic's glass partition and had spent 10 minutes being unable to decide what to do with what he'd seen before settling on telling Priya, because Priya was always the person you told things to. "Selkie," Priya said. She was not eating a granola bar this time. She was just standing in the corridor with her arms crossed and the look of someone who is reassembling their understanding of the last 11 years. "I worked with him on a case 2 years ago. He was good, technically good." "I know," Nora said. "How does someone do that? Work inside something and be actively destroying it at the same time?" Nora thought about it honestly. "I think the same way anyone does anything for long enough. You stop seeing the thing whole. You see the part you're focused on, and you build a story around it that makes the rest of it bearable." Priya looked at her. "That's a generous reading." "It's not generous, it's just what I think actually happens." She paused. "It doesn't make it less wrong." General Aldane requested to see her again at 17:30. The suite on the 4th floor looked different in the late afternoon light. Warmer, less clinical, the monitors still present, but the urgency around them dialed down to maintenance level. He was sitting up fully this time, a position that clearly cost him something in the shoulder, but that he had apparently decided was worth the cost. There was a second person in the room that Nora hadn't expected, a woman in her 60s in a NATO administrative uniform whose insignia put her at a level that Nora's revised clearance could now read accurately. Deputy Secretary Miriam Oha, NATO Medical and Personnel Oversight. She had flown in that morning. She had been in briefings for most of the day. She was looking at Nora with the specific attention of someone who has been receiving reports about a person and is now calibrating those reports against the actual human being. Aldane spoke first. "We owe you an explanation," he said, "about why you were placed here." "Drummond gave me the operational reasoning," Nora said. "The operational reasoning is accurate. It's not complete." He shifted slightly. The shoulder cost him. He absorbed it without commenting. 8 months ago, one of my staff identified a pattern in the Brussels courier case. The device type. The insertion methodology. The facility signatures. He paused. He also identified a secondary concern, that the investigation into the network had been partially captured, that someone inside the inquiry structure was managing what got found and when. "Hargrove's office," Nora said. "A person within it. Not Hargrove herself, that's been established." He looked at her steadily. "We needed the imaging evidence recovered through a channel that bypassed the inquiry structure entirely, which required someone inside this facility who had no established relationship with that structure, whose access to the imaging archive would appear incidental, and whose instincts under pressure were reliable enough that we could trust the outcome without being able to control the conditions." "You couldn't control the conditions," Nora said, "because you didn't know what conditions were going to exist." "No. We didn't know Fried was going to be in that room. We didn't know Selkie's access trail was going to surface this fast. We didn't know—" He stopped. "We built a plan around a person, and then we had to trust the person when the plan stopped working." He looked at her directly. "That's an uncomfortable thing to tell you. I know that." "Yes," she said, "it is." "You're angry." She considered that. "I'm not angry. I'm recalibrating." She paused. "There's a difference between being used and being trusted with something that required that specific approach. I'm still working out which one this was." Oha spoke for the first time. Her voice was quieter than her rank suggested. "That's an honest answer. More honest than most people give in this room after what you've been through in the last 36 hours. Nora looked at her. "What happens now? To Gerst? To Selka? To the device?" Oha set a folder on the bedside table. Physical documents. Not a tablet, which meant they were at a classification level that didn't travel digitally. Gerst will face federal charges related to intelligence, facilitation, and breach of protected medical protocols. Her cooperation has been noted and will be factored into the process, But her cooperation doesn't alter the underlying conduct. She paused. Selke has declined to cooperate at this time, which will factor into his process in the other direction. The device from last night's patient is being extracted this evening by a surgical team that's been cleared at the appropriate level. The patient has been informed and has consented. And the person inside Hargrove's office? Being addressed. The two words carried the weight of a process that was going to take considerably longer than a day, and was going to be unpleasant in ways that wouldn't be visible publicly, but that would conclude. Oha said them with the confidence of someone who had concluded things like this before. The imaging file you transmitted is now part of the Inspector General's formal evidence record. Your name is attached to it as the identifying clinician. She looked at Nora for a moment. That's not a small thing. That file is the foundation of a case that's been trying to build itself for 8 months. Nora absorbed this. She looked at Aldane, who was watching her with the particular attention of someone who has made a significant decision about a person and is seeing whether the person is going to match it. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Right now, nothing." He said it without deflection. "You've given us what we needed. The rest is process, and it'll happen without requiring more from you." He paused. "What I want to ask, and you can say no, and it will not affect anything I just said, is whether you'd consider a more formal arrangement. Not here specifically. A placement that reflects your actual background, with the clearance to match it, attached to a medical oversight function that doesn't have the structural problems this one has." The room was quiet. Outside the suite's single window, the Virginia light was going golden and flat in the way it goes in late afternoon, making everything look briefly more significant than it probably was. She thought about Ward C, the sergeant, and his ankle rotations. The medication log she'd been updating when the first alarm changed the air in the building. She thought about Priya in the break room, explaining the math that people do without asking permission, and how that math had been running on her for 6 weeks, and how it had felt to stand at the edge of the OR and watch the numbers climb. She thought about what she'd closed the door on, and why, and whether the reason still held. "I'll think about it," she said. Aldane nodded. That was enough. She found Mathers in his office at 1900, which was unusual. He was not a person who kept regular hours in an office, preferring to be in clinical spaces or not in the building at all. But he was there, sitting behind a desk that had too many papers on it in the organized way of someone who creates the impression of disorder to discourage interruptions, reading something on a tablet that he set face down when she knocked on the open door. "Whitaker." "I'm not going to take long," she said. "I wanted to say something before the administrative process turns this into official language and the official language stops meaning what it was supposed to mean." He looked at her. "Go ahead." "You stayed at the table last night. When Freed came through the door, you didn't move." "There was an open chest on my table." "I know why you did it. I'm just saying. I saw it." Something crossed his face that was not quite an expression, more like the shadow of one. "Is that what you came to say?" "Part of it." She looked at the papers on his desk, at the tablet face down with whatever he'd been reading before she knocked. "The protocol review you mentioned this morning. The structural problem with how this facility processes information from outside expected channels. I meant it." "I know you did. I want to help with it, if that's an option. However long I'm here." She paused. "Because the problem isn't specific to this building. I've worked in enough of these environments to know it's the same problem everywhere, and it keeps producing the same outcomes. Not because the people are bad, but because the system is designed to filter out certain voices before they reach the people who need to hear them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You think the system can be fixed?" "No," she said. "I think it can be made less bad. There's a difference." She almost smiled. "That's usually the most you can get." He looked at her for a long moment, the gray eyes, the 24 years, the face of a man who has been in this specific conversation with himself for some time and has not yet arrived at a conclusion he's comfortable with. "I'll put your name on the protocol working group." "That's enough," she said, and meant it. She left the building at 20:30. Not because her shift ended, her shift had technically ended many hours ago, but because Delphine Okafor had found her in the corridor at 20:15 and said, with the practical directness that was her only mode, Whitaker, you've been here for 38 hours. Go home. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. Go home. She went home. The drive was 40 minutes through the kind of Virginia dark that doesn't have a lot of ambient light to interrupt it, and she drove it with the window down because the air was warm and because the specific pressure that had been sitting behind her sternum for the last day and a half needed somewhere to go. And moving air helped with that in a way she had never been able to explain, but had long since stopped trying to. She thought about the 7 months in her service record, and the 14 months before them, and the people she had worked alongside in those places whose names she still knew the way you know things that mattered. She had left that work because she needed to, because the specific cost of it had reached a level that would have produced diminishing returns if she'd kept paying it without a break. She had told herself the door was closed and had mostly believed it. She thought about what Aldane had offered: the formal arrangement, the clearance, the function without Callaway Ridge's structural problems, the version of the work that was the work she actually knew how to do, rather than the version that had required her to spend 6 weeks being invisible and then step out of that invisibility at precisely the right moment. She hadn't said yes. She'd said she'd think about it. The thinking, she realized as she pulled onto the smaller road toward her apartment, had already been happening for most of the drive. The thinking was actually, she already knew what she was going to decide and was in the process of catching up to herself. Because here was the thing she understood now, in a way she hadn't quite articulated before. The 6 weeks of being dismissed, of being looked at and found insufficient, of being redirected and talked over and measured against the wrong standards by people who had already made their calculation and stopped looking. Those 6 weeks had not broken anything in her. They had been uncomfortable and sometimes quietly infuriating and occasionally clarifying in ways that were useful and occasionally in ways that were just painful. But they had not changed what she knew, or what she could do, or who she was when it counted. And that was the thing nobody could legislate out of a person. Not institutional hierarchy, not a placement designation, not a chart that said staff nurse 2 where it should have said something else entirely. The capability was still there whether the system acknowledged it or not. The only question was whether you were in a position to use it when it became necessary. She had been. And the reasons she'd been able to were not simple. They involved choices she hadn't made freely and structures she didn't fully trust, and a mission she'd been placed inside without her complete knowledge. All of that was true, and none of it canceled the other true thing, that 2 men were alive tonight who would not have been otherwise. That counted. She was going to let it count. She parked outside her apartment building and sat in the car for a few minutes. Not because she needed to, but because the dark was quiet and the air was still warm, and she was, for the first time in 38 hours, not required to be anywhere or do anything or read anything correctly. She could just exist in the space between one decision and the next. Then she went inside. The formal reclassification was processed 11 days later. The document was 4 pages of language that translated, in practical terms, to, "This person was always who she was. We simply failed to read the page correctly." It restored her service record in full, attached a commendation from the NATO Inspector General's office for her role in the evidence recovery, and cleared her for a placement with the NATO Medical Oversight Advisory Function operating out of a facility in Maryland that had, unlike Callaway Ridge, a structural mandate to include non-traditional expertise in its decision-making channels. The Selke case took 4 months to move through the federal system and concluded with a plea that carried a 12-year sentence and a permanent security clearance revocation. Gerst's case ran parallel and concluded with 8 years and the same revocation. The person within Hargrove's office, a senior analyst named Draper, who had been managing outbound intelligence traffic for 7 months, was the last to be formally charged and the first to try to bargain, which produced mixed results for everyone involved in the way that last-minute bargaining usually does. Hargrove herself was cleared of operational involvement. That finding did not entirely resolve the question of what she had known and when, and the internal review that examined that question ran for another 3 months and produced a report that Nora was not privy to. She did not ask to be. She had made her peace with the limits of what any investigation could cleanly resolve and had decided that clean resolution was a thing that mostly only existed in after-action reports written by people who hadn't been in the room. Mathers finished the protocol review working group in 6 weeks. Nora contributed to it remotely during her transition period, and the final document included a section on intake assessment for non-traditional placements that was cited 7 months later in a broader NATO medical personnel review as a model for addressing systemic blind spots in high-security medical environments. Her name was not in the publicly available version of that citation. She was fine with that. Priya Sathuraman was promoted to charge nurse at Callaway Ridge, which was a long time coming, and which Delphine Okafor announced with the same flat efficiency she announced everything, though people who knew her said she'd had a specific look on her face when she did it. General Aldane recovered fully. The shoulder gave him trouble for 6 months in cold weather, which he accepted with the pragmatic irritation of a man who has survived worse and knows it. He sent Nora one written communication during her transition, which was brief and specific and did not use the words "thank you" because neither of them were people who needed that particular phrase to carry the weight it was trying to carry. The sergeant with the spinal plate walked out of Callaway Ridge under his own power on a Tuesday morning in October. He sent a card to Ward C addressed to the bossy nurse, which was the most accurate description anyone had produced of her in 6 weeks, and which Delphine displayed on the ward's bulletin board without comment. There is a version of this story where the lesson is about institutions, about how they fail, how they miscategorize, how they build systems that protect their own certainty at the expense of accuracy. That version is not wrong. The institutions in this story failed in measurable ways with measurable consequences. And some of those consequences were addressed and some were not. And the ones that weren't will probably produce another version of this story in another building on another night, because that is what institutional failure does. But that is not the part that stays with Nora Whitaker on the drive home, or in the quiet before a decision, or in the moments when she is standing at the edge of something that needs to be done, and she is the only one positioned to do it. What stays with her is simpler than that. She knew what she knew. They told her she was wrong about that, and she stayed anyway, not loudly, not dramatically, not with the intention of being proven right. She stayed because the work mattered, and because the people in those rooms mattered, and because she did not need external validation to trust what she had learned over years and in conditions that she cannot fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. That is the thing nobody gave her. Not the clearance, not the commendation, not the working group or the reclassification or the quiet written note from a recovering general. Nobody gave her the knowledge. Nobody gave her the patience to hold it still while people told her it wasn't real. Nobody gave her the decision at 9:02 on a Tuesday morning to push open a door she had no standing to open. She walked through it herself. That is always, in the end, how it works. The system might catch up eventually. The record might be corrected. The right people might say the right things in the right rooms. But the moment of decision, the moment when you have to trust what you know against everything being told to you about what you should know, that moment belongs to the person standing in it. Nobody else can be there for you. Nobody else can stand still enough, long enough, to wait for the moment to arrive. And nobody, no rank, no title, no institution, no designation on a laminated badge, can take away what you carry once you've earned it. You just have to be willing to use it when it counts.